Hey, Meg, I got you something for our 3-week anniversary.
Wow, a Maroon 5 CD!
Yeah, I remember how you told me you like terrible music, so I thought you might appreciate it. Boo!
Hey guys, RanterInShades here, exercise my first Remember Rights vlog style. Some of the most popular videos on my channel are from my Worst Songs series that I upload at the end of each year. A group I've complained about in a number of those videos is the band we're talking about today, Maroon 5. I've noticed that every time I've brought them up in a video, I've always made mention of their decline in quality ever since their 2002 debut, Songs About Jane. In fact, I said this in Best Songs of 2012. But every time I talk about them, I always feel the need to mention their debut album, Songs About Jane, being an album I've held in high regard since my elementary school years, to the point where a video I want to make in the future is a track ranking video about it like the one I made about Boston's Self-Titled. I feel like this is the best video I could make to convey where these feelings about Maroon 5 come from. I understand this band probably isn't a particularly popular subject with my audience, but hey, maybe I can change a mind or two with this, or at least offer a different perspective. Plus, it's not like I've never taken a positive approach to an unpopular subject around these parts before, but I digress. Maroon 5 is a band I've listened to as far back as my elementary school years, when my music taste was just beginning to develop. They had some enjoyable singles that were really big in the early to mid 2000s. And not to mention, Songs About Jane was one of the first CDs I ever bought, and I played a lot of those songs in the early years of my drum lessons back when drums was my main instrument. This album's been with me for quite a long time, and even when I was getting into heavier music and more traditional styles of rock, it was never an album I could ever obfuscate for the purpose of appearing credible as a rock fan. The songs just meant that much to me, and the fact that I make reference to that every time I talk about Maroon 5 in my videos should imply that they still mean something to me. When people think of Maroon 5 nowadays, they think of a band that makes bland, corporate, poppy, safe music that appeals to the lowest common denominator. They think of a band that fell from grace in the 2010s, becoming the biggest example since Metallica of what it really means for a band to sell out. For some people, it may be hard to remember that it wasn't always like this. There was a time when Maroon 5 made pretty great music, when they were actually a band as opposed to a glorified Adam Levine solo project. While I've heard decent stuff from their next two albums, and while they've had a couple hits I found enjoyable since then, they've never made an album that stands toe-to-toe with Songs About Jane, and from the looks of it, they never will. Even if you don't like Maroon 5, I think we can all agree that since that album's heyday, they've never been the same. Ultimately, that's one of my biggest reasons for wanting to make this video, to put into perspective why I and others feel as strongly about this band's regression as we do by celebrating that moment in time where they knew what they were doing and hadn't yet succumbed to corporate mediocrity. In order to convey that, I'm going to take you through Songs About Jane and my personal ranking of the 12 tracks on the album. Before I start, though, there is another layer I'd like to add as to why I can't bring myself to hate Maroon 5 that a little backstory of the band should help you to understand. Vocalist Adam Levine and keyboardist Jesse Carmichael met at an overnight camp in the Catskills called Frenchwood's Festival of the Performing Arts. Old school viewers and people familiar with my back catalog of videos, and people that paid attention to the shirt I'm wearing, might recognize that name. For those new to the channel, I attended this camp from 2008 to 2010. It was where I had my first ever recording studio experience, my first video production experience, and met some awesome people and some really talented musicians and performers, akin to the kids in the movie Fame. So in addition to learning about what kinds of other famous people attended this camp, finding out that this was the place Maroon 5's roots trace back to really intrigued me. In fact, while this was unfortunately after my time attending the camp, Adam and Jesse made an appearance at Frenchwoods in the summer of 2011 and got the Rock Center, where I spent a lot of my time in those days, named after them. These days I tend to wonder how current campers and alumni feel about that, but it's still nonetheless cool that it happened, that Maroon 5 were able to have a still DRE moment like this. So that's where Adam and Jesse first knew each other. The two of them also attended a school in LA called the Brentwood School in 1994, where they met bassist Mickey Madden and drummer Ryan Dusick to form a band called Kara's Flowers. This band was a grungy Britpoppy affair, not too dissimilar to the kind of rock that was popular at the time. They signed with Reprise Records and recorded two albums, We Like Digging in 1995 and The Fourth World in 1997, before the members took time off to attend college. While Madden and Dusick attended school in LA, Levine and Carmichael went to New York for college. My headcanon is that their experience at Frenchwoods was a solid indicator that this was a great state to be in. And a great state to be in it was, because while there, the two of them were exposed to urban music of the area. They took a real liking to the hip-hop and funky R&B that was prevalent in New York, and it left a lasting impact on the direction they wanted to take their band in. So when they reconvened with Madden and Dusick in 2001, they recorded a demo of new material that got them picked up by Octone Records, a now defunct label owned by Universal. Octone really liked their song Sunday Morning, and was taken aback to find that it was made by the same Kara's Flowers band that made those 90s alt-rock records. Following this, per Octone's recommendation, the band recruited guitarist James Valentine, changed their name to reflect their new sound and new addition to the band, and Maroon 5 was officially in business. The urban influence should be very apparent when you listen to the songs on their debut. While funky rock and poppy rock both existed prior to the album's release, there was never really a band that sounded like this. And that's a big part of what made Songs About Jane so special, that it had its own sound. It was eclectic, vibey, and showed some solid musicianship from all the members, not just Levine. It's almost gratifying that he and Carmichael went to New York and immersed themselves in the soundscape of the area, because without that influence, Maroon 5 would have probably sounded much different. In addition to that, James Valentine was a Berkeley student and was friends with John Mayer while attending, before Mayer quit school after 2 semesters to pursue his career. John Mayer is known for having a very bluesy and syncopated style of guitar playing that coincides with his poppy songwriting, and there's no doubt some of that style rubbed off on Valentine that he would incorporate into Maroon 5's sound. Again, this range of influences mixing together to create the sound on this album should give a good idea as to what drew so many people to Maroon 5 in the 2000s and why this album is revered by so many people today. So let's take a look at why that is with a track ranking of Songs About Jane. Number 12. Much like I did in the Boston and Whitesnake videos, I'll start this out with the track that always got the least attention from me. Must Get Out is for sure the poppiest sounding song on the album, and I've never found it to be as fun as a lot of the other songs. You can still hear a lot of the cool elements that are more prominent throughout the rest of the album, but of its 12 tracks, this is the only one I'd describe as it exists. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate this song, but I've always seen it as bringing the least to the table. It's noticeably light, with the instrumentation being largely dialed back, and thus it sounds the most out of place. That said, I do like the simplicity of the keyboard part in the verses over top the backing pulse in the rhythm section. For pop rock, it's not a bad sound. It's just that the rest of the tracks show that the band is capable of more. The only other part I found to be cool about Must Get Out is the transition between the bridge and the final chorus, where we get a C minor chord before the tonic, G. It's for sure the most musically interesting thing about the song. I'm not sure how invested I am in the lyrics. It's very clearly about relationship problems, hinting at both Levine and the woman, who, given what this album's called, is named Jane, not knowing whether to drop the relationship or keep hanging on. For as much as it seems like they've both made their mind up about leaving, something keeps pulling them back. Levine believes that the problem lies in the city and that they need to leave, so this is basically the closest Maroon 5 have ever gotten to being pop punk. But you also gotta wonder if he's using the city as a scapegoat for the relationship's struggles. Overall, I get the feeling that this is the song that's saying the least. I have a feeling anyone clicking on this video with a predetermined opinion on Maroon 5 but are still deciding to see what I have to say probably aren't going to be swayed by this song, and I get that. But this is still the beginning of the countdown, and believe me when I say, the songs do get better.
Must get out of this segment. Need to get to better songs, food, water, atmosphere.
Number 11. Alright, now let's move on to the song that gets the second least amount of attention from me, if only because I heard it on the radio so goddamn much as a kid, She Will Be Loved. Being that this is the album's most successful single, as well as one of the few tracks from the album that's still included in Maroon 5's live sets, I'm sure that sentiment probably resonated with you with how sick of the song you likely are. Again, I get it, there's a reason this is closer to the bottom on the list. I was pretty tired of hearing the song all the time myself back in the day, but I did gradually warm up to it over time. If nothing else, I'd take listening to She Will Be Loved over Must Get Out any day. That might not mean much, but it's at least doing more to hold my attention. Let me just quickly get this out of the way. You know in the opening line when Levine says, "Beauty queen of only 18, she had some trouble with herself." Was I the only one that used to hear that as beauty queen of only 80? I was always like, oh geez, Adam Levine, I know you're kind of a horn dog, but do you really have a thing for old ladies like comic book guy when he dates Skinner's mom? It's not a wonder she has trouble with herself, if you know what I mean. But upon closer listens, it's 18, not AD, which is at least better. All joking aside, the main thing that always sold this song with me was the piano. It provides probably the best texture you could ask for in a song like this, especially in the bridge, where Carmichael has these harmonically interesting flourishes over a chord progression that's just alternating between C minor and B flat. He could just play those chords and be done, but he actually goes the extra mile with dressing his parts up. That's the thing about She Will Be Loved. The chord progressions are wildly simple, with the pre-chorus and chorus being a run-of-the-mill 1-5-6-4, but the embellishments and melodic ideas from both Carmichael as well as Valentine and the verses are what elevate the song to become a hell of a lot more interesting than I imagine it could have been had they taken the easy route with the composition. That little sort of solo Valentine does before the outro might not be as flashy as other solos on the album. Yes, there are some excellent solos on here, just you wait. But it sounds borderline atmospheric against the chords. Lyrically, this might seem like a typical love song, but there's always been something that gets you to raise an eyebrow. I've seen some interpretations of the song about how the girl in the song is a prostitute. Again, Adam, you really know how to pick them. Since it describes a girl that's young, dealing with her own insecurities, and always belonging to someone else, if you catch my drift. I'm not sure I'd go out of my way to say that's enough indication that she's a prostitute, since these are situations anyone can deal with, but the lyrics do paint a picture of a woman not knowing what she wants, and pushing away someone wanting to be there for her and give her the love she deserves. It's got this kind of teen rom-com vibe that does sound a little mushy and sappy from my adult perspective, but it's executed carefully enough that I'm not super annoyed, and that's why this was always a song I had a hard time disliking. This particular line was always my favorite.
It's not always rainbows and butterflies, it's compromise, it moves us along.
That's a really mature sentiment on how relationships are supposed to work. On the surface, romance appears picturesque and idealistic. Unless you're asexual or aromantic or someone with some questionable taste, to put it nicely, it's something we all want. But the underlying truth is that the method to which we can have that is for both parties to be able to bring their equal share of energy and be able to work with each other to make the relationship function, and it's going to involve making some compromises. But not everyone understands that, and the overarching reason why some relationships fail is because at least one party, doesn't matter which gender, and it can be both of you at the same time, does something to show they don't get that. That's why having this understanding is essential to being in a relationship, and although it's incredibly ironic coming from Adam Levine, I love that he expresses that understanding. Overall, She Will Be Loved works. It's by no means the best or most interesting song on the album, but it works. And that's ultimately the most I really want from tracks on an album I consider low tier. This is one of those songs I respect more than I like, but with how overplayed it always was growing up, I'm glad I have some respect for it. Number 10.
Watch the sunrise, say your goodbye.
This song might be another softer track, but one of the big things that I always really liked about Secret is the chord progressions. All the sections in the song have an assortment of chromatic dissension, and it hits in all the best spots. On top of a pretty standard pulse and do-6 drumming, we've got an A minor going to D6 to F major to E7 in the verses. But then there's the layer of Levine's vocal melody doing a consistent A minor blues scale, and it's kind of crazy how well it fits over these chords. And in the chorus, there's a B major chord thrown in after a C major that creates this dramatic effect, which is then followed up with a G minor 7 and A minor 7. One of the best things to do with a more dialed back and less energetic song is to have elements like this to make the song interesting, which shows a lot of skill as a songwriter. Even in the bridge, where not a lot is going on instrumentally, Levine does all these vocal harmonies to not allow time to be wasted with him going, "Oh, oh," and then Dusik does a really cool fill into the final chorus. Lyrically, Secret contains a lot of car metaphors like car overheats, I'm driving fast now, don't think I know how to go slow, and cool these engines, calm these jets, to convey feelings of desire, and probably horniness too, let's just be honest. I'm pretty sure that's what the secret Levine alludes to is like, hey, guess what? You wanna hear a secret? I'm totally fucking horny right now.
Oh no!
The only issue I've always had with these lyrics is that there isn't really any context being given on where these feelings are coming from, outside of probably the chorus, which we'll get to in a bit. This sprinkling of metaphors always came across as kind of random, but they do enough to set a tone that I'm able to look past that. The car metaphors are at least implemented in a more clever manner than in Driver's License. The chorus really does pull everything together with a pretty interesting revelation. Listen to what he says here.
I know I don't know you, but I want you so bad.
My first time listening to this song was around the cusp of when I was starting puberty and starting to really like girls. And me being a shy fuck not knowing how to effectively make a move like we're told we're supposed to do, that line definitely resonated with me. The girls I admired from afar back in those days were not people I really knew that well, but it wouldn't stop me from imagining how swell it would be if I got to date one of them. And I imagine that's the kind of experience Levine was writing about here, those moments before he knew Jane and made his first move with her. In real life, saying something like what he says in the chorus probably wouldn't work, but the chord progression and the texture give off this vibe that the situation is a lot more adult, another one of those rom-com-y scenarios. Secret might not be the most exciting track on the album, but it's got so many spicy elements that I can't help but view it as an underrated gem. It's not a song I listen to as much, but unlike with Must Get Out and She Will Be Loved, I like being reminded of everything cool it has to offer. The chord progressions and melody lines overtop them do an exceptional job at showing how good of songwriters Maroon 5 actually were, and I definitely recommend checking it out. Number 9.
You know what they say, Gary? I'm easy like Sunday morning.
Yeah, I'd much rather be listening to that song than the song I'm about to talk about because it totally slaps, but you know, this song's cool too.
That may be all I need. Darkness,
You can probably tell by now that the songs about Jane are very relationship-oriented. It's an album all about the rise, fall, and tribulations of Adam Levine's relationship with Jane. Some songs are negative, while others are uplifting and curious. Sunday Morning was always a song that I thought of as potentially being both. When you have a song open with the line, "Sunday morning, rain is falling," it doesn't set a particularly cheery tone. Rain falling is usually indicative of sadness, mirroring the tears and negative emotions of the moment. So you infer that as meaning that something significant, whether positive or negative, happened on a dark and rainy Sunday morning. But that's not what the music seems to be indicating. The chord progression is a pretty consistent D minor, G, C, a 2-5-1 progression that's actually a staple in jazz. It's an uplifting progression that only occasionally changes the G to a G7 and the C to a C major 7 to add some tension to the vibe. Similar to what I said about She Will Be Loved, Sunday Morning is another song that makes great use of the piano. It's actually also a big thing I like about the aforementioned Easy by the Commodores now that I think about it. Overtop the funky drum beat, everything just sounds really relaxing. It's kinda nice considering the weather being described. It's not impacting the tone of the song, and it doesn't seem to have any negative effect on the relationship depicted in the lyrics, which is pretty wholesome. That's honestly the best word I can use to describe Sunday Morning. It's the most wholesome song on the album. The best part of the song is easily the instrumental break after the second chorus. The song already has a pretty funky feel, but this is the part where those urban influences really start to show. There's record scratching you can hear, it sounds like a saxophone is thrown in, and all the instruments are playing this syncopated melody in unison that implements some chromatic moments. These rhythms really pop out, and throwing in notes like the E flat before the E and that G flat during the little walk down from G to F help to amplify that popping. And ending this section with a chromatic ascension from C to D makes for a cool way to transition back to the main chord progression. And from there, Dusic's drumming doesn't sound as restrictive. He's playing on the ride cymbal for the rest of the song, and Valentine implements more funky comping to his playing, making the song not sound as soft as it tended to sound in the first half of the song. And with that in mind, I also gotta give a special mention to the outro. Much like what I said in my Whitesnake video about the song Don't Turn Away having a fun fading outro where the band is just jamming out, that's what's going on here. But the song this always really reminded me of is Hey Jude by the Beatles. I don't just say that because of a similar kind of fading out at the end, but Levine also goes pretty crazy here, akin to what Paul McCartney does during the ever so uplifting Na 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 section. In both instances, you can't help but just smile at how excited they sound, while the band rocks out and the drummer throws in some pretty big fills to match the energy. Also, that random mention of always made me think of this moment in Aladdin during A Whole New World, where he picks a flower for Jasmine and she puts it in her hair. Again, wholesome as shit. This might not be my favorite of the singles released from songs about Jane, but it makes for a really strong one. It's not a wonder why the people at Octone liked this song as much as they did. Unlike She Will Be Loved, Sunday Morning shows more instrumental competence and makes for a more feel-good jam, despite it also being a generally softer track. We may still be somewhat low in the ranking, but this has always been a song I saw as the track that bridges the gap tonally between the softer tracks and the ones that go harder, and I hope that's something you guys are taking note of as we go further into this ranking, because the songs are only going to get more and more fun. Number 8.
How dare you say that my behavior's unacceptable? So condescending, unnecessarily critical.
I really like when the opening track on an album gets you feeling pretty hyped. In addition to setting the tone for the album, it's also providing you with an introduction to the album's themes and even the band as a whole. It's why most albums have their opening track be exciting and ear-catching. While Harder to Breathe might not be my favorite track on songs about Jane, I think it makes for a great album opener. Hearing those 8 snare hits followed by the beginning of the verse riff really gets me looking forward to all that I'm going to be experiencing with this album. At this point in the countdown, you should also notice a bit of a juxtaposition in the album's tone, with this being the first of the breakup songs. Having the album open with a song like Harder to Breathe keys us in on the fact that not only is the relationship over, but what Levine's view of the relationship is after the fact. The way I see songs like this contrast with songs like the 3 tracks we've discussed previously is that Levine is able to acknowledge that these were things that he did feel for a time. Think of it like what a wise boy I showed a PNG of at the beginning of the number 11 segment once said.
The only way I can feel this sad now is if I felt something really good before.
That's how I see these songs as being able to coexist on the album. It's interesting that the album starts out with a song this frustrated. The verses have Levine calling Jane out for being condescending, unnecessarily critical, inconsistent, confusing, unfair, all those things one doesn't want in a partner. The bridge also implies that he's ultimately the one getting the upper hand when all is said and done. The chorus does strike me as a bit threatening, like,
"Without me, you're gonna have nothing, bitch."
And what doesn't help is this line in the first verse.
I have the tendency of getting very physical, so watch your step, cause if I do, you need a miracle.
Like, Adam, bro, that doesn't really make you look good here. But I also like that he makes it known in the chorus that he did do his part to fight for the relationship as a means of showing that this is going to be a major loss for her. I've also seen the line, "It's getting harder and harder to breathe," be interpreted as being an allegory to how the band feels about their label and feeling like they must make songs the label wants rather than the stuff they want to create, like Alter Bridge did with Ties That Bind. I'm not sure I believe that, since, for one, it doesn't make sense in the context of the song. Why would you tack something like that onto a song largely spent telling off an ex? And for two, given the direction Maroon 5 ended up going in after songs about Jane, it wouldn't make sense to be saying this right now. At best, maybe it's one of those retroactive interpretations that applies to how things are now, but that doesn't change the original intent behind the line. Levine felt suffocated by the relationship, and he doesn't think Jane will be able to survive on her own after he leaves, hence having difficulty breathing. But above all that, Harder to Breathe grooves pretty hard. I've always liked how simple the verse riff is over top the syncopated and pulsating drum beat. It really pops out and hits hard, matching the aggression in the lyrics. The chorus also has a fun drive, and I've always found it really endearing when you hear those backing vocals going, "Yeah, yeah, yeah," that Ryan Dusick accentuates with some snare hits. There's also a pretty cool solo at the beginning of the bridge. It's kind of drowned out by the chords, but those chords are so freaky, and the little twang you hear in the rhythm guitar sounds so cool that it almost enhances the effect. I've always found C-sharp minor, or D-flat minor depending on your preference, to be an awesome key, and learning what these chords actually are and how they function within the key was pretty fascinating to do while researching this video. And that's what makes this song as cool of a listen as it is, and why I view it as being a solid opening track on the album. Number 7. We've seen some decently funky stuff so far in this countdown, but Not Coming Home is what I believe to be the most genuinely funky song on the album. At this point in the countdown is where you guys are going to be introduced to one of my favorite things about the album, James Valentine's wah work. It's on full display throughout the song, and it's utilized greatly. A key characteristic of funky guitar playing is that it doesn't sound completely clean or quantized. The guitarist is just letting the rhythm go on autopilot against the backing groove. It sounds kind of sloppy in spots, but that's sort of the point. And the reason why I say this is the funkiest song on the album is because that particular element is more prominent here than on any of the other tracks. What could factor into that effect is the fact that this song is actually recorded live, allowing those imperfections to take place in that moment. I've often wondered why a live recording of the song was included on the album as opposed to a studio recording, as well as if a studio version even exists that might have been included on other copies out there. The one conclusion I've ever reached is that this particular performance must have outshined whatever studio recording the band tried to make. And that's saying something, because were it not for the crowd noise and Adam saying, "Thank you!" at the end, it sounds like a legit studio mix. So unless the audience is fake, like I've seen accusations towards Kiss's Alive album for doing, this implies that they were this tight live. My only questions now are where this was recorded, how big the crowd was, and indeed how the crowd was going this wild for a band that hadn't yet released their debut album. My research is indicating that this could just be one of those things we never know the answer to. Anybody watching that might have information on this that I just can't seem to find, please leave a comment letting me know, because I would love to know. And while you're at it, the 80% of you that aren't subscribed, hey, you got nothing to lose, so click it, why don't you? I really like the simplicity of the drum beat and how it contrasts with the rhythms from the other instruments. Even in the chorus, when the instrumentation cuts out, that snare hit on beat 3 really pops out underneath the syncopated rhythm from the harmonized vocals. And the chord progression is also awesome. Again, C-sharp minor is an awesome key, and I love the regression's use of the 5-7 chord, G-sharp 7, as well as the raised 7th degree, B-sharp. Valentine also does these cool wall licks over the chord change between A and G sharp. It's harmonically appropriate, and I just love how it sounds against these chords. And what's also harmonically cool is in the pre-chorus, where there's a consistent C-sharp minor chord with only the bass note changing that might seem dissonant on paper, but it gives this spicy tickle to your ear. Adam Levine's vocal performance is also very soulful. I already mentioned the funky rhythm he does in the chorus, but there's also some bluesy moments like this part in the second verse.
Say these things that I don't want
The pre-chorus also has him hit some pretty high belty notes that sound incredible against the already zesty chord progression. I don't know what to say, Not Coming Home has all the right ingredients for the classic Maroon 5 sound. This song is also one of my favorites lyrically. Levine alludes to mixed signals, abuse, and generally toxic behavior that he experienced in his relationship. But the cool thing is that it shows him rising above it and walking away. The lyrics in the pre-chorus were always my favorite.
Does it make you mad? Find it I have grown. I bet it hurts so bad to see the strength that I have shown.
I know for a fact, as someone that has cut ties with manipulative people before, that those kinds of people hate not having power over you, and having the strength to walk away and not look back absolutely pisses them off. Whenever I've had moments where I had to do that, those lines were definitely playing in my mind. Not to mention the straight eighths and the chords striking to the rhythm of you marching off in disgust from what's become of the person. Overall, Not Coming Home is great. It shows the band leaning the hardest into their funk sensibilities and has some of the most piercing lyrics Levine has written. This may be in the middle of the ranking, but it's genuinely a pretty badass track, which isn't something I say about most of the tracks on the album. Number 6. An interesting fact about Songs About Jane is that it was a sleeper success. While the album came out in 2002, with Harder to Breathe being its debut single, it wasn't until 2 years later when This Love really broke them out. It isn't as musically or even lyrically interesting as Not Coming Home by any means, but I have such a sentimental history with This Love that it only makes sense for me to put it a little higher. This was the first song of Maroon 5's that I ever heard, and it more than likely is the first one you remember too. I remember hearing it at the beginning of a Kids Bop commercial back then, and later being blown away at how the song actually sounded. And along with it being the very first song I learned to play on drums in my lessons, it became my favorite song at the time. That may sound weird to say now, but remember, this was when my music taste was just beginning to develop and I wasn't listening to very many bands. And if you've seen my Green Day video, you'll remember me saying that American Idiot was the album that changed everything for me at that time. And that album came out at around the same time Maroon 5 started catching on in the mainstream with hits like This Love. So these two albums more or less defined the back half of elementary school for me, and maybe also play a part in why I consider 2004 to be my favorite year for music in the 2000s. What a splash to make! This is one of the most fun songs I can remember from my childhood. This is the second track on the album after Harder to Breathe, and while that song hits hard at the gate, the tone here is more dialed back with more of the funk elements also introducing themselves. The big contributing factor to what makes the song so catchy is the rhythms. The chromatic bass notes hitting on the offbeats leading up to the downbeat with some consistent strumming and comping from James Valentine filling the gaps, and all the while having this dramatic sounding chord progression. There's lots of 7th chords, and in particular the 5-7-1 relationship sounds great, especially in C minor, another one of my all-time favorite keys. I also like how the song isn't as blunt and angry as tracks like Harder to Breathe and Not Coming Home. Levine's vocal delivery strikes me as being a little more mournful about the end of his relationship, while also recognizing that the relationship wasn't healthy for him. This is a woman he tried considerably hard to please, whether sexually or otherwise, to the point where he was blinded to how he was being affected. Listening to his delivery, it almost seems as if he doesn't have the energy to be upset at the relationship being over. That's not to say his performance doesn't have its moments. I always thought this was a cool, soulful melody.
Kept playing love like it was just a game, pretending to feel the same.
And the big G7 chord at the end of the atmospheric bridge is another shining moment.
Every inch of you, 'cause I know that's what you want me to do.
You also got a smile at the final chorus. The chords sound fuller, with Jesse Carmichael's keyboards throwing in some fills, and listening to Levine's improv over the lyrics, you can tell he's having fun with it. This is another song where I feel like the whole band is having fun, and I imagine it's a fun time live. Maybe one of the only truly fun times nowadays. But that's what made the song so fun to listen to back in the day, and why it still holds up today. It almost has no business being as fun as it is. Even people that view Maroon 5 as a lost cause act these days are never one to deny how special This Love was. And while there are 5 tracks of theirs outranking it, none of which are singles, it's always going to hold a special place in my heart. Also, someone needs to make a mashup of this song with This Love by Pantera. They have a similar enough tempo in spots that I can actually see it maybe working.
This love has taken its toll on me. She said goodbye too many times before.
Number 5.
I'll never leave you behind or treat you unkind.
How sweet that the closing track on the album is called Sweetest Goodbye. It's such a bang to go out on that I can't help but feel kinda touched. For as fed up as Levine has sounded on a number of the tracks we've covered so far, this one feels like the most sentimental of the breakup songs on the album. The verses clearly indicate that the relationship with Jane is indeed over, but the pre-chorus seems to imply that maybe Levine isn't as bitter towards her as other songs on the album would have you think. He seems to be saying that should she ever want to return to him, he would not only welcome that idea, but he would be better this time around. And when he says,
I know you understand.
It almost feels as if she too is aware of the idea that getting back together might not be out of the question, though the chorus makes it pretty clear that this is purely sexual. But I'd like to think that if Levine feels this strongly about wanting one last chance to say to her, holy fucking fuck, that body of yours is absurd. It is truly unreal how fucking hot you are. Like, it blows my mind. His intentions are for it to lead to a genuine second shot at having a romantic relationship where they're both better for each other. But even if that doesn't happen, hey, they at least got to shag one last time before Jane departs for good. And I doubt Levine is the type to complain about that. The musical elements correspond greatly to this finale vibe. While Not Coming Home has the full package of funkiness, I'd say Sweetest Goodbye has the funkiest chord progression, which has always been my favorite thing about this song. Valentine's chords sound so electrifying and exciting, but it's the harmonic structure that really pushes the song over the top. Going from C-flat major to B-flat major to E-flat minor to that friggin' E-flat minor 6, this is such a badass progression, and it's all executed with this laid-back feel so you aren't being beaten over the head. Stuff like that is why I've always considered James Valentine to be an exceptional guitarist, let alone one of my favorites to play Ernie Ball guitars, as well as my favorite member of the band. But the cherry on top is that there's this soulful E-flat minor guitar solo where he really makes his guitar sing. It's not even the flashiest solo on the album, that will come up shortly, but it's such an amazing moment. I also gotta give a special mention to Levine's vocal performance. After the second chorus before the solo, listen to how he sings the word feel. Those harmonies. They're so rich and make for an excellent lead-in into the solo. And after the solo, he does this really shouty improvisation of the chorus over top the original backing vocals, and all the while, Valentine is still wailing. There's such a party going on that it makes for such a sensational conclusion to the album. To call back to Don't Turn Away in the Whitesnake video again, I said that the song ending with the band rocking the hell out as it fades out made for an uplifting and satisfying conclusion to the album, and it's exactly what happens in Sweetest Goodbye. After all the fun you've had jamming with songs about Jane, this goodbye the album ends with is, well, sweet. The musicianship is not only top-notch, but the song as a whole is just so much fun, and that's why it's always going to be one of my favorites. Number 4. I remember back in the days before I actually learned to analyze lyrics and pay attention to what's being said, I always assumed Shiver was a song about being shy about making a move on a girl. I mean, when you're crushing on someone, it's only natural that your heart will race and you'll feel chills at even the thought of them or the mention of their name. But since this is Adam Levine we're talking about, I'm sure we can tell what this is actually about. And that's when I start to think, damn, this shit really flew over my head when I was 11. I mean, for fuck's sake, listen to what he says here.
Chew me up, you spit me out. Enjoy the taste I leave in your mouth.
Jesus, Adam, way to be subtle. But yep, this is another sexual jam. But I like how the overt sexuality is decorated with lyrics that describe feeling both awestruck about the girl in question, as well as being self-aware to realize he's being given a runaround treatment. It almost feels like there's a modicum of anxiety and confusion in the lyrics. So it would appear that this is the song that bridges the gap between the lovey sexy time songs and the blunt call-out songs. And the backing instrumentation gives it a sort of foreplay kind of feel, which helps the song to be as hard-hitting as it is. The drum beat is groovy, and I like the melodic E harmonic minor riff. The chorus always struck me as sounding kind of like a boy band, but it's one of the only songs on the album where Valentine gets to rip, so it ends up balancing out. And in the second verse, Carmichael's keyboards are brought to the forefront of the instrumentation and create a relaxing texture that contrasts from the rest of the song in a really smooth way. But then we get to the best part of the song. There was a time before my mom got me Guitar Hero and I was exposed to the numerous wild solos present in the game where this was my favorite guitar solo I'd ever heard. I love the phrasing, the bends are really satisfying, especially over the chord progression, and it's one of those solos that isn't incredibly fast and leaves some space in between the licks, but it's so soaring and played with such tenacity and soul that not calling it great would be an insult. I remember being pretty addicted to this solo back in the day, to the point where I'd say it definitely played a part in influencing me to want to develop a craft for soloing. Hell, whenever I give a song a solo treatment in any of my videos, I feel like it's my way of recreating the kind of effect Valentine gives to this song with his solo. Or maybe I'm just ripping off Stevie T, I don't know. Obviously, I've heard a bunch of better solos since then, but the solo in Shiver cannot be ignored and must be acknowledged. And it's moments like this that get me to view James Valentine as being as talented and exceptional of a guitarist as I do. Shiver is one of the songs about Jane that rocks the hardest. It riffs well, there's interesting textures, the band sounds tight, and the cherry on top is that solo. I could easily see people familiar with the deep cuts on the album calling this their favorite song of Maroon 5's, and that's a valid take. With how much I played the song to death when I was first starting to take guitar seriously, I did kind of burn myself out on it. But Shiver is no doubt one of the best songs this band has ever created, but I feel the next 3 tracks in this ranking have a little something more to offer. Number 3. Now, why might I be showing this image?
You ever turn your head and look, see if I'm gone, 'cause
Tangled is a song I remember my ears really perking up at my first time hearing it with how futuristic it sounded. It's the song I'd say is the most standout texturally on the album. So at this point I gotta give some kudos to the album's producer, Matt Wallace, for helping to realize this sound. It's one thing to be a funky band, but it's another thing to sound like a funky band from a sci-fi adventure, and that's a big part of what makes Tangled as cool of a song as it is. This song is also the most lyrically distinct on the album. We've covered breakup songs where Levine makes it no secret how upset he is at Jane and how she treated him in their relationship, but this song has him showing remorse and regret for his actions. What actions would these be? The song never makes clear, but we can infer from that line in Harder to Breathe about getting physical, as well as our knowledge of how much of a sex hound Levine is, what those actions probably were. Regardless, this is the most vulnerable he sounds. He's showing that he is willing to swallow his pride and acknowledge that for as much as his partner has committed transgressions that she needs to be held accountable for, he too must hold himself accountable for his own wrongdoings in the relationship. And he understands that she probably doesn't want to hear him try to mitigate the situation and just leave, as sometimes that's really your best course of action. And what's more is there's also his admission in the chorus of not even being sure himself what it was that led him to commit his sins, becoming
Tangled up.
as he puts it. Stuff like this takes major balls to even admit to yourself, let alone someone else, so I have no qualms calling these the best lyrics on the album. I can only imagine these themes playing in the minds of anyone who's ever been given the cancel treatment, which, given the recurring meme that's been coming up throughout this video, would include Adam Levine himself. Funny how that works. I've also talked a good bit throughout this video about Ryan Dusick's drumming, and I'd say Tangled has the coolest patterns he lays down. He's really groovy on a lot of the other tracks, but this one has the most unconventional arrangement. It's one thing to play a simple kick snare beat that gets the job done, but listen to the beat he plays in the verses. That's such pristine syncopation and subdivision, and interesting placements of the kick and snare hits. He also does some excellent fills, especially towards the end of the song, so I'd say this song is a good candidate for his best performance on the album. The big thing that I've always loved about Tangled, though, is the guitar tones. In the pre-chorus, in addition to another really poppin' beat from Dusick, I love the wrung-out chords in both the guitar and keyboard, and the bass feels more brought out during those sections as well, and it even sounds like Mickey Madden's doing some slapping in spots. The keyboards also at times sound like something you hear in a video game, and really help to give the song the most distinct tone on the album. But as for my favorite thing about the song, I'm not sure if this qualifies as a solo, mainly since it's kinda short, but listen to this. I already talked in the Not Coming Home segment about Valentine's wah work, but this part right here is what I believe to be the best wah sound I have ever heard. Yes, I say this in the absolute least ironic and hyperbolic manner I can. The best wah sound I have ever heard. I've listened to plenty of other songs that feature prominent usage of wah on the guitar, but with the possible exceptions of Voodoo Child by Jimi Hendrix and Is There Love in Space by Joe Satriani, Tangled's usage was what really stuck with me. It made such an impression on me that when I got my wah pedal not too long after I started taking guitar more seriously, I tried really hard to figure out how to emulate this particular sound, and could not for the life of me pick it apart. Even today, I'm still wondering if Valentine is using a harmonizer effect, playing the two harmonizing lines at the same time, or if they were recorded separately, or even if it's Carmichael playing this and I've been given credit to the wrong guy. Either way, it sounds so freaking cool, I wish it went on longer, and I gotta give props to not only Valentine, but also Matt Wallace for taking the approach to production that he did to bring this out. Tangled has so much going for it, from the futuristic production to the sci-fi sounding keyboards, to Madden's deep bass lines, to Dusick's driven and intricate drum patterns, to Levine's remorseful lyrics, to that magnificently delicious wah sound. It is absolutely one of Maroon 5's best songs that utilizes the members' talents greatly. It almost feels weird knowing that this isn't even my favorite song of theirs. The two songs coming next have always been neck and neck with me, and I was for the longest time conflicted on which of the two would come out on top. But Tangled was always very close in the running, so I'd still consider this a good placement in the ranking. And with a song as unique and cool sounding as this coming at this point in the list, imagine how awesome the next one's gotta be. Number 2. If there was ever a Maroon 5 song I'd call heavy, it would be this. In addition to this being the breakup song on the album where I'd say Levine is at his bluntest, it's the song where everyone in the band goes all in guns a-blazing, doing more than enough to match Levine's tone. There have been some tracks we've gone over that I'd say rock pretty hard, but they don't reach the intensity of Through With You. And it's songs like this that influenced my belief of the band being credible as rock musicians, and one that I always think of when I think of how mediocre their latter output is. The song stands out structurally as well. This isn't a song with your typical verse, chorus, chorus. It actually has its first two verses before the first chorus, which then segues immediately into the next verse. Then there's the bridge, followed by the second chorus, instrumental break, and then final chorus. The verses come and go pretty quickly, but they flow nicely into one another. They might not be as vicious as in a song like Harder to Breathe, but they strike me as being more matter-of-fact with how disappointed Levine is with Jane. Here, he's focusing on her lack of clear communication and commitment to the relationship, leading him to not trust her. In my opinion, this is the most surefire sign that a relationship isn't working, because communication, commitment, and trust are vital to how a relationship thrives.
I spend every hour waiting for a phone call that I know will never come.
I love that rhythm there. I showcased something a lot like that in Best Songs of 2022 when talking about Shivers by Ed Sheeran, how a more complex vocal rhythm does a lot to spice up an otherwise simple performance. It might be small, but this is up there as being one of my favorite moments of any of Adam Levine's vocal performances. Like I said earlier, the instrumentation matches the mood excellently. One moment I've always liked is in the third verse. After a comparatively dialed-back chorus, the chords sound more open, Dusik starts playing a sloshy hi-hat, and while Levine recalls the sexual excitement, as he does, Dusik does this.
Remember how it felt when I touched you? Oh, 'cause I remember very well.
I always found that really clever, mimicking the climax like that. I also really dig Carmichael's performance on this song. I like that he's using a piano sound that adds some interesting coloring to the dramatic chord progression. In the bridge, the tone transitions to a soft Latin vibe, and he plays a fluttery F7 chord after the line finishes. And the tone coloring he utilizes sounds especially awesome in the transition between this verse and the following chorus. Getting back to the chord progression, we're already in one of my favorite keys, the dramatic key known as B-flat minor, and it makes such a cool usage of the minor 4 chord, E-flat minor, which sounds pretty spicy next to the F7 in the chorus. I also like the way the guitar climbs up the B-flat minor scale during the progression, and I do have a soft spot for Levine's backing vocals adding to the dramatic effect. And do I even need to mention how awesome it sounds in the final part of the chorus where everyone plays a descending third pattern in unison? It gives that line, "I called to let you know I'm through with you," a lot of power and emphasis. Literally the only thing wrong with the song is that Valentine doesn't wail like he did in Shiver. So if he's not gonna do that, then I will. The instrumental break is also one of my favorite moments in any Maroon 5 song. It's another part where everyone plays the melody in unison. There's lots of chromatic alternation, some irregular notes, and interesting rhythmic arrangement. In particular, that moment where they play the A flat on the and of 4 makes for a nice accent. This is also where Dusik slams the hardest with his drumming. His fills are huge, and the sloshy hi-hat does so much to contribute to how big this section is. This is why Through With You barely beats out Tangled for being my favorite of his performances on the album. It's to a point where a word I almost want to use to describe it is thrashy, which feels like such a weird word to use when talking about a Maroon 5 song. But that should really speak volumes as to how incredible Through With You is. It's such a good balance of aggression between the instrumentation and the lyrics, with the tone and progression to boot. It's such a great song that I love coming back to, and I wish more people knew about it. But there's something about my number one that scratches a particular itch a little more, and if you've been following along with the track listing, by process of elimination, you know what song that is. Number 1. Whenever I've made these album track rankings, I've always felt my number 1 entry would surprise the audience. They've never been recognizable singles, and there are elements from previously discussed tracks that one might argue make for more valid reasons for that to be number 1 in their respective rankings. While the ordering of the entries in my countdowns are at the end of the day based on my subjective opinions, no duh, I've been making more of an effort in recent years to order the entries in a way that's, for lack of a better term, objective and true to myself, so I won't look back on a video and regret not ordering the segments differently. Seriously, 2017 Shades, I won't stop harping on how short-sighted of a decision this was. With that in mind, why The Sun? Well, to tell you the truth, it's the song I've always viewed as the glorious amalgamation of songs about Jane's strengths, and it contains all the best elements of Maroon 5's sound. It's got the relaxing groove from Sunday Morning, the cool chord choices from Sweetest Goodbye, the funky wall work from Not Coming Home, and futuristic sounding production akin to Tangled. I feel so relaxed listening to this song, and it's got a vibe that makes me feel like I'm listening to a Jim Lang tune in a Hey Arnold episode during a scene where a character's walking and thinking, just like what Levine does in this song. That combination of Carmichael's keyboards and Valentine playing with that tremolo effect, along with what I think is some chorusing, that reminds me a bit of the effects Kim Thayil of Soundgarden uses in Black Hole Sun. Wow, another Sun song. Up against Dusic's slow, funky groove and Madden's thick bass line, the sound is just incredible. It was always this song that made me view Songs About Jane as a truly special and unique sounding album. Another thing that always stood out to me about The Sun is the difference in dynamics throughout the song. The verses mainly have Levine singing over bass and drums, and when Carmichael enters with those fusion-sounding keyboards, it adds some lounge-esque color to the mellowness of this section. I like how there isn't much guitar in the verses outside of some small wah licks, helping Valentine's part in the chorus to really shine through. And that's especially the case by the end of the chorus, where after the F major 7 chord, there's a B minor 7 flat 5 and an E major that function as the turnaround back to the main groove. The bridge is also an awesome sounding part. Here we have a different kind of effect usage in the guitars. Just some wrung out A minor 7, C major, and E7 chords with a chorus effect. And Levine does this consistent harmonization throughout this part, and it builds up to higher pitches with such badass execution. With how freaky his vocals sound over the chord progression, in addition to the fill Dusick does into the final chorus, I'd say this is my favorite vocal performance he gives on the album. And that's not even mentioning this embellishment he throws in a little bit later in the final chorus. Seriously, I could just not be that familiar with much of Maroon 5's stuff after this album, but can anyone name another Maroon 5 song where Levine sings like this? Of course, another major factor in why I love this song so much is Valentine's solo at the end. Much like Entangled, the sound here is so unlike any other song I've heard with prominent wah usage that I once again feel like this is the best wah sound I've ever heard. Adding on to that, while the solo might not be as shreddy as in Shiver, it sounds particularly jazzy and calls back to those urban influences in such a cool way. I especially love when he plays triplets down in A minor scale. It's to a point where I kinda hate that the song fades out at this point, because I just want the solo to go on for a little longer with how much fun it sounds like he's having. Like Sweetest Goodbye, this is a song I can only imagine the band having the time of their lives jamming through during practices and everyone taking some extended solos. If there's any criticism I have of Songs About Jane, it would probably be the ordering of the tracks. I mostly view the album as a breakup record, but it has its share of love songs that I always saw as flashbacks to the nice times the relationship definitely had. I kind of wish the album told a more structured narrative, and I especially feel that with The Sun coming in the middle of the track listing. I say that because this song involves Levine reminiscing about the past when he had a modicum of innocence and naivete before and during his relationship with Jane. The bridge also implies through lines like a broken record player and back and forth and here and gone, that the on and off aspect of the relationship became a bit much for him. But even despite that, despite all the harsh things he's said in other tracks, he makes it clear in the chorus that he doesn't regret meeting her. He acknowledges that for as dysfunctional as their relationship was, it had its positive aspects, and this experience he had of knowing Jane is something he'll always remember. That's a powerful thing to say about someone you hold a lot of negative feelings towards, that you learned so much from the experience that helped you to become the person you are today, that feeling regret for knowing them doesn't seem accurate. Levine also appears to be crying to his mother about the decline of the relationship. Even if the relationship was shitty and it's for the best that it ended, you still feel a sense of loss. This was something that made you happy for a while, and you aren't sure how you can manage once the plug is pulled. And when his mother tells him the battle's almost won and we're only several miles from the sun, that's her way of reassuring him that better days are ahead. That's another powerful thing to hear, especially in the wake of an emotional low point. No matter how much the nihilists and defeatists of the world refuse to accept it, it's something to always remember. It's just like how Breathin' by Ariana Grande and As It Was by Harry Styles hit so close to home with me in the Best Songs series. The song almost feels like it has no business being here with how much everything hits you like this, but I love its presence on the album nonetheless. This emotional message, combined with the pristine instrumentation, easily makes The Sun my favorite Maroon 5 song, on Songs About Jane or otherwise, and it's a song I will always recommend checking out. I'm sure we all know the story from here. Songs About Jane went mega platinum, and This Love, She Will Be Loved, Harder to Breathe, and Sunday Morning became major hits for the band by 2004, to the point where they're still included in their live sets to this day. A couple years later, in 2006, Ryan Dusick left the band due to some flaring injuries and general disillusionment with the touring lifestyle. Although he's credited as the musical director on the band's next album, 2007's It Won't Be Soon Before Long, he was replaced with the band's current drummer, Matt Flynn. They also added another keyboardist in the band, PJ Morton, who had previously filled in for Jesse Carmichael while he took a hiatus from the band to focus on musical studies before his return in 2014, thus becoming Maroon 6, I guess. They then added a 7th member to play some additional synths and guitars, Sam Farrer, a former touring member who also played in the alternative rock band Phantom Planet, to become Maroon 7. Their name was more misleading than mine supposedly is. In 2020, Farrer would also replace Mickey Madden as the bassist after he took a leave of absence following his arrest for alleged domestic violence, so now they're back to being Maroon 6. Cool. Also noteworthy is Adam Levine becoming a judge on the reality singing competition show The Voice, which many believe to be an indicator of when he became Mr. Solo Project. There was also the band's infamous Super Bowl performance in 2019 with Big Boy from Outkast and Travis Astroworld Scott that got a bunch of people mad that there wasn't an adequate enough performance of Sweet Victory in honor of the recent death of SpongeBob SquarePants creator Stephen Hillenburg. And of course, there's also those DMs of Levine's I've been memeing on throughout this video. I remember people acting shocked and appalled at this, but I mean, if you really pay attention to the hypersexual and animalistic nature of the lyrics, it really shouldn't be that much of a surprise. Not saying it excuses him, just that it wasn't really a shot to me. I don't recall hearing much material back in the day from It Won't Be Soon Before Long, or their third album from 2010, Hands All Over. That could be due to the albums not being promoted incredibly well, but to be fair, that could also be because this was around the time I stopped listening to the radio voluntarily due to how jaded I'd become with pop music, and putting more of my focus into my rock and metal exploration. Regardless, for as poppy as these albums are, they're seen these days as the only other Maroon 5 albums that are at all listenable. Ever since then, they've just gotten poppier and poppier, and sounding less and less like a band in the process. And while I have a soft spot for moves like Jagger, and while I'll stick up for Sugar like I did in Best Songs of 2015, as well as Stereo Hearts by Gym Class Heroes that Adam Levine does guest vocals on that I talked about in the previously mentioned Best Songs of 2012, everything else they've made is generally agreed upon to be bland pop bullshit, ranging from middle-of-the-road forgettable to gratingly offensive sonically. Hearing songs like Payphone, One More Night, Daylight, Love Somebody, Animals, Moles, Feelings, aka the Diamond Axe Studios theme song, Don't Wanna Know, and of course, Girls Like You and Memories, it's hard to believe this is even the same band that made an album as great as Songs About Jane, and that's what makes this transformation all the more tragic. I understand that this was a necessary direction for them to go in to avoid fading away, and even the idea that it can be seen as a natural progression for them given their always present hip-hop influences and pop sensibilities. However, deep down, I think Adam Levine and company know they're better than this. After all, the big reason I featured Sugar in Best Songs of 2015 was because this was the closest they'd gotten to sounding like their old selves in such a long time. So I believe that somewhere on the inside, that funky pop rock band from 2002 still exists. It's just that they'd rather play it safe with material that's inoffensive enough for radio play. It's disappointing to see, especially when Levine is willing to make the rock is dead argument, claiming, I don't know where it is. If it's around, no one's invited me to the party, knowing he and the guys could be doing so much to remedy that. With an album like Songs About Jane under their belt, the potential is very much there. It's just a matter of if they do anything with it. Do I expect Maroon 5 to make another album like Songs About Jane, or even It Won't Be Soon Before Long?
No.
But I do believe that this is something the band understands deep down. No matter what, Songs About Jane is always going to be an album that I hold many positive regards towards. It's one thing to compare it to the stuff Maroon 5 does nowadays, but it's nonetheless an album I'm always going to view as, simply put, an excellent pop rock outing on par with an artist like Prince, in addition to being one of my first favorite albums. I've been pretty critical of this band in previous videos, to say the least, but that's because this album set the bar high for them, to me anyway, that I want to see them at least try to reach. No matter what I think of their latter period output though, the existence of Songs About Jane makes Maroon 5 such a hard band for me to hate. Even as they go further and further down the spiral of mediocrity, I'll always be one to sing this album's praise. And I highly recommend you guys check out the rest of the tracks you might not have been familiar with before watching this video, because they're clear examples of deep cuts that, in my opinion, outshine the singles for as great of songs as the singles are. And thus concludes my thoughts on Maroon 5 and deep dive into their debut. I had a lot of fun revisiting these songs and discovering some deeper insight about them, and I hope you enjoyed my analysis and have a better understanding of where my feelings about the band come from. Before I head off, I'd also like to shout out the deep Discog dive Mike the Snare did on them that made for some great help with researching this video. If you'd like to learn more about the rest of Maroon 5's discography and career, check that video out. Other than that, thank you very much for watching this video. Hopefully I was able to intrigue some curiosity about the songs on this album. Take care and have a nice day. I'm Shades, and I'll see you next time.